Hello, and welcome to the English Talk community. I'm Julia, and today we're going to talk about how to become fluent in English through advanced listening and speaking practice. Have you ever felt lost when someone speaks English too fast? Or maybe you have trouble expressing your thoughts in English even when you know the words? If you answered yes, you are not alone. Millions of people around the world go through the same situation. But here's the secret that will change everything for you. Fluency doesn't come from perfection. It comes from consistent and intelligent practice. I want you to close your eyes for just a moment and imagine this scenario with me. Picture yourself 6 months from now, sitting in a coffee shop in London, having a natural conversation with a stranger about your favorite books. You're laughing, sharing stories, and the words are flowing effortlessly from your mouth. You're not thinking about verb tenses or worrying about your accent. You're just being yourself, expressing your thoughts and feelings in English as naturally as you would in your native language. This isn't a fantasy. This is absolutely possible for you, and I'm going to show you exactly how to get there. You know, I've been teaching English for over a decade, and I've worked with thousands of students from all corners of the world. I've seen brilliant engineers from Berlin struggle to order food in English, despite knowing advanced technical vocabulary. I've watched talented artists from Barcelona freeze up completely when trying to describe their work to English-speaking clients. I've observed dedicated students from Lisbon spend years memorizing grammar rules, only to panic when faced with a real conversation. But here's what I've also seen. I've witnessed those same people transform completely. That engineer from Berlin? She now leads international meetings with confidence. The artist from Barcelona? He recently gave a TED Talk in English that went viral. The student from Lisbon? She's now working as a translator for the European Union. What made the difference wasn't their intelligence or natural talent. It was their approach to learning. Most people approach English learning backwards. They spend months, even years, studying grammar rules, memorizing vocabulary lists, and taking practice tests. Then they wonder why they can't understand movies without subtitles or why they freeze up in real conversations. It's like trying to learn to swim by reading about swimming techniques without ever getting in the water. You might understand the theory perfectly, but when you jump in the pool, you'll still sink. The truth is, your brain learns language through exposure and practice, not through analysis and memorization. When you were a child learning your first language, nobody taught you grammar rules. You didn't study vocabulary lists. You listened, you repeated, you made mistakes, you tried again. You learned through immersion, through constant exposure to the language being used naturally. And that's exactly how you need to approach English now. I remember working with Maria, a marketing director from Rome who came to me completely frustrated with her English learning journey. She had been studying English for 5 years, had completed multiple grammar courses, and could score high on written tests. But when she attended international conferences for work, she felt like everyone was speaking a different language. The English she heard in real life was nothing like the textbook English she had studied. People spoke with contractions, they used slang, they talked fast, they interrupted each other, they used cultural references she didn't understand. Maria told me she felt like a fraud. She had impressive qualifications on paper, but she couldn't participate in the informal conversations that happened during coffee breaks. She couldn't laugh at jokes because she didn't understand them quickly enough. She couldn't share her own ideas spontaneously because she was too busy translating from Italian in her head. She was ready to give up on her international career dreams. But Maria's story has a beautiful ending. Within 4 months of changing her approach, she was confidently presenting at international conferences. Within 8 months, she was promoted to head of international marketing for her company. What changed? She stopped studying English and started living in English. This is the mindset shift I want you to make today. Stop thinking of English as a subject to study and start thinking of it as a skill to develop. You don't study riding a bicycle, you practice riding a bicycle. You don't study swimming, you practice swimming. And you don't study fluency, you practice fluency. The good news is that we live in an amazing time for English learners. You have access to more English content than ever before. You can listen to podcasts from native speakers, watch YouTube videos on any topic that interests you, follow English speakers on social media, join online communities, and even have conversations with people from around the world without leaving your house. The opportunities for exposure are endless. But here's the catch. Having access to all this content doesn't automatically make you fluent. You need to use it strategically. You need to approach it with intention. You need to know what to listen for, how to practice effectively, and how to turn passive consumption into active skill development. That's exactly what we're going to explore together in today's episode. I'm going to share with you the specific techniques that have helped thousands of my students break through their fluency barriers. These aren't theoretical concepts or academic exercises. These are practical, proven methods that you can start using immediately. We're going to talk about how to train your ear to understand natural English speech, including all those contractions, reduced sounds, and connected words that make fast English so challenging. We're going to explore how to develop your speaking confidence so you can express your thoughts without hesitation. We're going to discover how to turn your daily English exposure into powerful learning opportunities. Most importantly, we're going to change your relationship with mistakes and imperfection. I want you to understand that fluency isn't about speaking perfectly. It's about communicating effectively. Native speakers make mistakes all the time. They pause, they correct themselves, they use filler words, they sometimes struggle to find the right expression. What makes them fluent isn't perfection. It's their comfort with the language and their ability to keep the conversation flowing despite imperfections. Before we dive deeper into these life-changing techniques, I need your help to keep this community growing. If you're ready to transform your English learning journey and finally achieve the fluency you've been dreaming of, hit that like button right now. Your like tells me that you're serious about your English goals and helps other learners discover this content that could change their lives too. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode of the English Talk community. This is where your English transformation happens. I'm genuinely curious about your English learning story. In the comments below, tell me about a time when you felt lost or frustrated while trying to understand fast English. Maybe it was during a movie, a conversation, or a work meeting. What was that experience like for you? Or if you've had a breakthrough moment when English suddenly clicked, I'd love to hear about that too. Your story could inspire someone else in our community who's going through the exact same challenges. Remember, we're all in this journey together, and your experience matters. Imagine being able to watch a movie in English without subtitles and understand every word, or having a natural conversation with a native speaker without hesitating. Does that seem impossible right now? It's not. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you techniques that really work, real stories of people who went from zero to fluency, and practical methods you can start using today. If you really want to improve your English, hit the like button on this episode right now. That shows me you're committed to your learning journey. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. Last week, I received a message from Thomas, a software developer from Munich. He told me that just 8 months ago, he avoided English-speaking clients because he was embarrassed about his English. Today, he's leading international development teams and even giving presentations to English-speaking investors. What changed? He discovered something that most English learners never figure out: the difference between learning about English and learning to use English. Thomas didn't suddenly become a grammar expert. He didn't memorize thousands of new words. He didn't take expensive courses or hire private tutors. Instead, he learned to train his brain the same way native speakers naturally develop their language skills. And I'm about to show you exactly how he did it, along with dozens of other success stories that will inspire you and give you a clear roadmap to follow. Right now, I want you to think about the last time you tried to watch something in English without subtitles. Maybe it was a Netflix series everyone was talking about, or a YouTube video that looked interesting. How did it feel when the character started speaking quickly? When they used expressions you'd never heard before? When they laughed at jokes you didn't understand? I bet you felt frustrated, maybe even defeated. You might have thought your English just isn't good enough yet. But here's what I want you to understand. That feeling of being overwhelmed when listening to natural English isn't a sign that you're not ready. It's actually a sign that you're exactly where you need to be to make rapid progress. Your brain is encountering real English, not textbook English, and it's working hard to make sense of it. That struggle you feel is actually your brain building new neural pathways, creating the connections you need for true fluency. I remember when I was learning Portuguese, I felt exactly the same way. I could read Portuguese newspapers and understand most of what was written, but when I tried to watch Brazilian soap operas, I was completely lost. The actors spoke so fast, they used slang I'd never encountered, and they had regional accents that made everything sound foreign to me. I felt like I had been studying a completely different language. But then I discovered something fascinating. Instead of avoiding content that challenged me, I started embracing it. I found shows and movies where I could understand maybe 30 or 40%, and I watched them anyway. I didn't worry about understanding everything. I focused on catching what I could and letting my brain gradually fill in the gaps. And something amazing happened. Within a few months, those same shows that had seemed impossible were becoming clear to me. This is the secret that transformed my language learning, and it's the same secret that has helped thousands of my students break through their listening barriers. Your brain is incredibly adaptable, but it needs the right kind of input to develop fluency. It needs to hear language used naturally, in context, with all the messiness and imperfection of real communication. Think about David, a business consultant from Paris who contacted me last year. He had been studying English for over 10 years, had excellent scores on proficiency tests, and could write professional emails without any problems. But when he attended international conferences, he felt like an outsider. During presentations, he could follow the main points, but he missed the subtle jokes, the cultural references, and the informal conversations that happened during breaks. David was frustrated because he felt like he had invested so much time and effort into English, but he still couldn't connect with people the way he wanted to. He could communicate facts and information, but he couldn't build relationships or show his personality. He felt like he was always one step behind in conversations, processing what people said while they had already moved on to the next topic. The breakthrough came when David stopped trying to understand everything perfectly and started focusing on understanding enough to participate. He realized that even native speakers don't catch every single word in conversations. They use context, body language, and their general knowledge to fill in gaps. They focus on the overall meaning rather than analyzing every detail. Within 6 months of applying the techniques I'm going to share with you today, David was not only participating fully in international conferences, but he was also being invited to speak at them. Companies started specifically requesting him for projects because of his ability to communicate effectively with English-speaking teams. He went from being the quiet person in meetings to being the one facilitating discussions and building bridges between different cultures. The transformation wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck. David learned to work with his brain instead of against it. He discovered how to turn everyday English exposure into powerful learning opportunities. He learned to hear English the way native speakers hear it, focusing on rhythm, intonation, and meaning rather than individual words. And here's the most exciting part. The techniques that worked for David, Thomas, and hundreds of my other students will work for you too. These aren't methods that require special talent or perfect conditions. They're strategies that anyone can use, regardless of their current level or how much time they have available. I want you to imagine yourself 3 months from now. You're watching your favorite English YouTube channel, and you realize you haven't looked at the subtitles once. You're actually thinking in English, reacting to the content naturally, maybe even laughing out loud at jokes. You pick up your phone and leave a comment in English without translating from your native language first. The words just flow naturally. Or picture yourself in a video call with English-speaking colleagues. Instead of preparing exactly what you're going to say beforehand, you're responding spontaneously to questions. You're sharing ideas, asking for clarification when you need it, and even making small talk before the meeting starts. You feel confident, relaxed, and authentically yourself. This isn't a fantasy. This is what happens when you train your brain to process English naturally instead of analytically. When you stop trying to translate everything and start thinking directly in English. When you learn to embrace the messiness of real communication instead of seeking the perfection of textbook exercises. The students who see the fastest progress are those who commit fully to this approach. They're willing to feel uncomfortable sometimes, to not understand everything immediately, to make mistakes and keep going anyway. They understand that fluency is a skill you develop through practice, not a knowledge you acquire through study. Before we begin, I want you to know something. I understand exactly how you feel. I've been through moments when I felt frustrated, when words simply wouldn't come out of my mouth the way I wanted them to. It's normal to feel this way. The difference between those who give up and those who succeed isn't talent or luck. It's the right approach. Take a deep breath, relax, and let's start this journey together. You're in the right place, at the right time. You know, there's something deeply personal I want to share with you. When I first started learning Portuguese, I had this dream of being able to connect with my Brazilian friends in their native language. I had studied for months. I knew all the basic vocabulary, I could conjugate verbs, and I felt ready to have real conversations. But when I sat down with my friend Carolina for what I thought would be my first real Portuguese conversation, I froze completely. She asked me a simple question about my weekend, and even though I understood every word she said, my mind went blank. I knew exactly what I wanted to say in English, but when I tried to form the words in Portuguese, They just wouldn't come. I stammered. I paused awkwardly, and eventually I gave up and switched back to English. I felt so embarrassed and disappointed in myself. Here I was, someone who teaches language learning, and I couldn't even have a basic conversation in the language I had been studying. That night, I went home feeling like a complete failure. I questioned whether I was really qualified to help other people learn languages when I was struggling so much myself. I wondered if maybe I just didn't have the natural ability for language learning that I thought I did. All those doubts and insecurities that my students tell me about, I was experiencing them firsthand. But you know what? That moment of failure became one of the most valuable experiences of my teaching career. Because it reminded me of something I had forgotten. Learning a language isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's deeply emotional. It's vulnerable. When you try to speak in a foreign language, you're putting yourself out there in a way that feels scary and uncertain. I realized that all those years of helping students with their English, I had been focusing so much on techniques and methods that I sometimes forgot about the human side of language learning. The fear of making mistakes, the frustration when you can't express what you're thinking, the embarrassment when people don't understand you, the overwhelming feeling when everyone around you seems to speak so much faster and more naturally than you do. Every single person who has ever learned a second language has felt exactly what you're feeling right now. That anxiety when you have to speak English in front of others. That sinking feeling when you realize you didn't understand something important in a conversation. That frustration when you know what you want to say but you can't find the right words. That disappointment when you feel like you're not making progress as quickly as you hoped. I want you to know that these feelings don't mean you're not capable of becoming fluent. They don't mean you're not smart enough or dedicated enough. They mean you're human, and you're pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, which is exactly what you need to do to grow. Let me tell you about Elena, a marketing manager from Valencia, who joined one of my programs last year. During our first session, she actually started crying when I asked her to introduce herself in English. She told me she felt so stupid whenever she tried to speak English at work. She said her colleagues were patient with her, but she could see them getting frustrated when she took too long to express her ideas. She felt like she was holding back her entire team. Elena had been studying English for years, but every time she had to speak in a meeting, her heart would race, her palms would sweat, and her mind would go blank. She told me she had started avoiding situations where she might have to speak English, which was limiting her career opportunities. She felt trapped between her fear of speaking and her need to communicate for her job. What Elena didn't realize is that her emotional response was actually normal and, in many ways, healthy. It showed that she cared about communicating well, that she wanted to be understood, and that she was aware of the importance of English in her professional life. The problem wasn't her emotions. It was that she had never learned how to work with them instead of against them. I told Elena the same thing I'm telling you right now. Your feelings about learning English are valid, but they don't have to control your progress. Fear and frustration are natural parts of the learning process, but they become problematic only when we let them stop us from practicing. Think about learning to drive a car. The first time you sat behind the wheel, you probably felt nervous, maybe even scared. Your hands might have been shaking, your heart might have been beating fast, and you probably made some mistakes. But you didn't stop driving because you felt nervous. You kept practicing until those feelings of anxiety transformed into confidence. Learning English works the same way. The nervousness you feel when speaking, the frustration when you don't understand something, the embarrassment when you make mistakes, these are all temporary feelings that will fade as you gain more experience and confidence. I remember working with Roberto, an architect from Rome who told me he felt like giving up on English completely. He had been trying to improve his English for 3 years, and he felt like he wasn't making any real progress. He could read technical documents in English for his work, but when he tried to participate in international video conferences, he felt completely out of his depth. Roberto described feeling like he was watching his colleagues speak a completely different language during meetings. He could understand maybe half of what they said, but by the time he processed the information and formulated a response, the conversation had moved on to something else. He felt invisible and irrelevant, like his expertise didn't matter because he couldn't communicate it effectively in English. The breakthrough for Roberto came when he realized that his perfectionist mindset was actually holding him back. He had been so afraid of making mistakes that he rarely spoke at all. He was waiting until he felt completely confident before participating in conversations, but confidence only comes through practice, not through preparation. I helped Roberto understand that native speakers make mistakes all the time. They stumble over words, they lose their train of thought, they have to ask for clarification. What makes them effective communicators isn't perfection. It's their willingness to keep talking despite imperfections. Within 4 months, Roberto was actively participating in international meetings. He wasn't perfect, and he still made mistakes, but he had learned to communicate his ideas clearly and to ask for help when he needed it. His colleagues began to seek out his expertise because they could see his passion and knowledge, even when his English wasn't flawless. The truth is, everyone who has achieved fluency in English has gone through exactly what you're going through right now. They've felt overwhelmed, discouraged, and sometimes ready to quit. But they kept going anyway, not because they were more talented or more motivated, but because they learned to be patient with themselves and to celebrate small progress instead of demanding immediate perfection. Many people believe that fluency means speaking perfectly, without errors, with a native accent. This is the biggest lie about learning English. Real fluency means effective communication. It means being able to express your ideas, understand what others say, and connect with people. You don't need to sound like a talking dictionary. You need to sound like yourself, speaking English. Let's break down this pressure for perfection that's preventing you from practicing. I want to tell you about one of the most damaging myths in language learning, and it's something that holds back more students than any other single factor. It's this idea that fluency equals perfection. That somehow, when you become fluent in English, you'll speak like a news anchor, never stumble over words, never pause to think, and never make any mistakes. This couldn't be further from the truth, and believing it is probably the #1 reason why so many dedicated learners give up on their English journey. Let me share something with you that might shock you. Last month, I was having lunch with my friend James, who's a native English speaker from London. He's incredibly well-educated, works as a lawyer, and has been speaking English his entire life. During our conversation, he said something like, "I was thinking about what you said yesterday, and I think you're absolutely... what's the word? Correct? No, that's not right. You're spot on about that situation." Did you notice what happened there? James, a native speaker, stumbled over his words, searched for the right expression, corrected himself, and still didn't use the most sophisticated vocabulary. He said spot on instead of something more formal like absolutely accurate. But did that make him less fluent? Of course not. He communicated his idea clearly, and I understood exactly what he meant. This is what real fluency looks like. It's not about speaking like a textbook or sounding like you swallowed a dictionary. It's about getting your message across effectively, connecting with other people, and expressing your personality through the language. Native speakers pause, they say and they repeat themselves. They use simple words when complex ones would be more precise, and they make mistakes all the time. I remember working with Carmen, a doctor from Barcelona, who came to me completely frustrated with her English. She had an incredible vocabulary, knew complex medical terminology, and could write research papers in English that were grammatically perfect. But when she attended international medical conferences, she felt like her English wasn't good enough because she didn't sound like the keynote speakers. Carmen had fallen into the perfection trap. She was comparing her English to the most polished, prepared presentations she heard at conferences, not realizing that those speakers had spent hours rehearsing their talks. When those same doctors were having casual conversations during coffee breaks, they sounded much more like regular people. They used contractions, they spoke with regional accents, they made small grammatical errors, and they sometimes searched for words just like she did. The breakthrough for Carmen came when I showed her recordings of famous TED Talks by non-native English speakers. We listened to speakers from Germany, Japan, India, and Nigeria who had given incredibly powerful presentations that had been viewed millions of times. These speakers had accents, they occasionally made small mistakes, and they didn't sound like they were born in London or New York. But their ideas were compelling, their passion was evident, and they connected with their audiences in meaningful ways. Carmen realized that she had been trying to sound like someone she wasn't instead of being the best English-speaking version of herself. She had been so focused on eliminating her accent and avoiding all mistakes that she had lost sight of the real goal, communicating her expertise and passion for medicine to an international audience. Think about some of the most successful non-native English speakers in the world. Arnold Schwarzenegger became one of the most recognizable actors in Hollywood with a strong Austrian accent. Shakira has sold millions of albums and given countless interviews in English while maintaining her Colombian accent. These people didn't succeed despite their accents. They succeeded because they focused on clear communication and authentic self-expression, rather than trying to sound like someone else. The obsession with perfect pronunciation and native-like accents actually works against effective communication. When you're constantly worried about how you sound, you can't focus on what you're saying. When you're trying to eliminate every trace of your native language from your English, you're using mental energy that could be better spent on organizing your thoughts and connecting with your listener. I want you to think about people you know who speak your native language as a second language. Maybe you have colleagues or friends who learned your language as adults. Do you judge them for having accents? Do you think less of their intelligence or competence because they don't sound exactly like native speakers? Of course not. You probably admire their ability to communicate in multiple languages, and you focus on what they're saying rather than how they're saying it. The same is true when you speak English. People are much more interested in your ideas, your personality, and your expertise than they are in whether you pronounce every word exactly like a native speaker. In fact, trying too hard to sound native can sometimes make you sound artificial or rehearsed instead of natural and authentic. Let me tell you about Philippe, an engineer from Lyon who spent years trying to perfect his American accent. He watched hours of American movies, practiced pronunciation exercises, and even hired a speech coach. His accent did improve, but something strange happened. His English started sounding forced and unnatural. He was so focused on making the right sounds that he lost the natural rhythm and flow of conversation. Felipe's colleagues started commenting that he sounded different, and not necessarily in a good way. He had lost his authentic voice in pursuit of an artificial ideal. When he finally relaxed and stopped trying so hard to sound American, his English actually became more effective. He kept the pronunciation improvements that felt natural to him, but he stopped trying to completely transform his speaking voice. The most successful English learners I've worked with understand that fluency is about communication, not imitation. They work on clear pronunciation because it helps people understand them better, not because they want to sound like someone else. They expand their vocabulary because it gives them more ways to express their ideas, not because they want to show off their language knowledge. Real fluency means being able to have the conversation you want to have, express the ideas you want to express, and build the relationships you want to build. It means understanding others and being understood by them. It means being able to be yourself in English, not becoming a different person who happens to speak perfect textbook English. When you stop chasing perfection and start focusing on connection, something magical happens. You become more confident because you're not constantly judging yourself against an impossible standard. You become more natural because you're not trying to be someone you're not. And paradoxically, you actually become more fluent because you're using your mental energy for communication instead of self-criticism. Let me tell you about Marco, an engineer from Madrid who came to work in London. On his first day at work, he understood only half of what his colleagues were saying in meetings. Marco felt lost and embarrassed. He knew grammar, had decent vocabulary, but in real practice, everything seemed too fast and confusing. Have you ever felt like this? Marco decided he needed to change his approach completely. He stopped studying grammar and started focusing only on listening and speaking. Marco had always been a methodical person. In university, he had excelled at mathematics and engineering because he could break down complex problems into logical steps and solve them systematically. When he decided to learn English, he applied the same approach. He bought grammar books, created vocabulary spreadsheets, and spent hours every evening studying rules and exceptions. By the time he finished his engineering degree, Marco could pass any written English test with flying colors. His professors were impressed with his technical English writing. His thesis supervisor even commented that Marco's English was more precise than many native speakers. Marco felt confident about his English abilities and excited about the opportunity to work for a prestigious engineering firm in London. He had dreamed of this international career move for years, and finally, his hard work was paying off. But nothing could have prepared Marco for that first morning meeting in the London office. His new manager, Sarah, introduced him to the team and then launched into a discussion about the current project. Marco sat there with a smile frozen on his face, desperately trying to follow the conversation. The English he was hearing sounded nothing like the clear, formal language he had studied in textbooks. Sarah spoke quickly and used contractions constantly. Instead of saying, "We will not be able to complete this by Friday," she said something that sounded like, "We won't be able to get this done by Friday." Marco knew what contractions were in theory, but hearing them in rapid natural speech was completely different. Then there was Michael, whose Scottish accent made everything sound like a foreign language, and Priya, who spoke so fast that her words seemed to blend together into one continuous stream of sound. The meeting lasted an hour, and by the end, Marco felt physically exhausted from the mental effort of trying to understand. He had caught maybe half of what was discussed, and he wasn't even sure about that half. When Sarah asked if he had any questions, Marco just smiled and shook his head, too embarrassed to admit how lost he felt. During lunch, Marco sat with his new colleagues, hoping that informal conversation would be easier to follow. But it was actually worse. In the meeting, at least they were discussing technical topics that Marco understood professionally. At lunch, they talked about weekend plans, television shows, and office gossip using expressions and cultural references that were completely unfamiliar to him. When someone made a joke, everyone laughed except Marco, who was still trying to figure out what had been said. That evening, Marco called his girlfriend Anna back in Madrid and told her about his disastrous first day. He felt like a fraud. Here he was, supposedly qualified enough to work for an international engineering firm, but he couldn't even follow a basic conversation with his colleagues. Anna tried to reassure him, telling him it was just first-day nerves and that things would get better with time. But the next few days weren't any better. Marco found himself nodding along to conversations he didn't understand, pretending to follow discussions that were completely unclear to him. He started avoiding informal interactions with colleagues, eating lunch at his desk, and declining invitations to after-work drinks. He was terrified that if people tried to have real conversations with him, they would discover how limited his English really was. The worst part was that Marco knew his colleagues were nice people who wanted to include him. Sarah made an effort to speak more slowly during meetings when she remembered, and Michael often repeated important points to make sure Marco understood. But Marco could see the slight impatience in their eyes when they had to explain things multiple times, and he hated feeling like a burden on the team. 2 weeks into his new job, Marco had a moment of clarity during a particularly difficult meeting. The team was discussing a problem with the project timeline, and Marco actually had some valuable insights based on his experience in Madrid. He knew exactly what needed to be done and had solved similar problems before. But when he tried to explain his ideas, the words came out slowly and awkwardly. By the time he finished speaking, the conversation had already moved on to other solutions. That night, Marco sat in his small London apartment, feeling frustrated and defeated. He realized that all those years of studying English had prepared him to read technical documents and write formal reports, but they hadn't prepared him to communicate with real people in real situations. He could understand English perfectly when it was written clearly on a page, but when it came from the mouths of native speakers at natural speed with natural pronunciation and natural expressions, he was lost. Marco made a decision that changed everything. He was going to stop studying English the way he had been studying it and start learning English the way children learn their first language. He put away his grammar books and vocabulary lists and decided to immerse himself completely in listening to natural English speech. He started by finding podcasts about engineering and technology, topics he was already familiar with. At first, he could barely understand the main ideas, but he didn't give up. Marco listened to the same episodes multiple times, not trying to understand every word, but focusing on getting comfortable with the rhythm and flow of natural English speech. Marco also began watching British television series, starting with shows that had simple dialogue and clear situations. He chose comedies and dramas where he could use visual context to help him understand what was happening. Instead of getting frustrated when he missed dialogue, Marco treated it like background music that he was gradually learning to decode. The breakthrough came when Marco realized he needed to stop translating in his head. Every time he heard English, his brain automatically tried to convert it to Spanish first, then process the meaning. This mental translation was slowing him down and making it impossible to follow natural conversations. Marco forced himself to start thinking directly in English, even if his thoughts were simple and sometimes incorrect. Marco started watching English series, but not in the traditional way. He would choose short scenes of 2 minutes and watch them 5 times in a row without subtitles. Then he would write down what he understood. In the beginning, it was just scattered words, but week after week, he could understand complete sentences. In parallel, he practiced speaking alone, repeating the same scenes. In 6 months, Marco was actively participating in work meetings. The secret was intelligent repetition, not the quantity of new content. The transformation in Marco's approach was dramatic. Instead of trying to consume as much English content as possible, he decided to go deep with small amounts of material. He downloaded episodes of a British workplace comedy called The Office and selected 2-minute clips that showed typical office interactions. These weren't random clips. Marco specifically chose scenes with situations he might encounter at work: colleagues discussing projects, people making small talk by the coffee machine, or teams brainstorming solutions to problems. The first scene Marco chose was a simple conversation between two characters discussing their weekend plans. He watched it once and felt completely overwhelmed. The actors spoke quickly, used contractions, and their British accents made everything sound foreign to his ears. When he tried to write down what he had understood, Marco could only capture a few isolated words: weekend, going, maybe, and Saturday. It was discouraging, but he had committed to this new method. Marco watched the same scene 4 more times in a row. By the third viewing, he started to catch connecting words like and, but, and so. By the 5th viewing, he could identify when questions were being asked, even if he didn't understand all the words. Something interesting was happening in his brain. The sounds that had seemed like meaningless noise were starting to form patterns he could recognize. After writing down everything he could remember, Marco played the scene again, this time trying to repeat the dialogue along with the actors. This felt awkward and embarrassing at first, even though he was alone in his apartment. His pronunciation was terrible, and he could only manage fragments of sentences. But Marco persisted, speaking along with the characters even when he didn't understand what he was saying. The next day, Marco chose the same scene again. This time, when he watched it the first time, he understood significantly more. Words that had been unclear the day before now sounded familiar. Phrases that had seemed like gibberish were starting to make sense. Marco realized that his brain needed time to process and organize the sounds he was hearing. The repetition was allowing his mind to create connections between sounds and meanings. By the end of the first week, Marco could understand about 60% of his chosen scene. More importantly, when he repeated the dialogue, he was starting to match the rhythm and intonation of the native speakers. He wasn't just learning words, he was learning how English sounds when it's spoken naturally by native speakers. Marco continued this process with different scenes throughout the week. He noticed that certain expressions and sentence patterns appeared repeatedly across different conversations. Phrases like, "How was your weekend?" and "I was thinking we could," became familiar not just as vocabulary, but as complete units of meaning that he could recognize instantly when he heard them. After 2 weeks of this intensive practice, something remarkable happened at work. During a casual conversation with his colleague Michael, Marco suddenly understood a joke that Michael made about the office coffee machine. For the first time since starting his job, Marco laughed naturally at the right moment, not because he was trying to fit in, but because he actually got the humor. Michael looked surprised and pleased, and they ended up having a 5-minute conversation about coffee preferences. Marco expanded his practice routine by adding speaking exercises to his listening work. After watching each scene multiple times, he would turn off the video and try to recreate the conversations from memory. He would play both parts of a dialogue, switching between characters and trying to maintain the natural flow of conversation. This felt strange at first, like he was talking to himself. But Marco discovered it was incredibly effective for building his speaking confidence. The beauty of Marco's method was that he was learning English the way it's actually used, not the way it's taught in textbooks. He was absorbing natural pronunciation, common expressions, and conversational patterns all at the same time. When someone at work said, "Could you have a look at this?" Marco didn't need to translate it or think about it. He immediately understood it as a polite way of asking for help. By the 3rd month, Marco had progressed to longer scenes and more complex conversations. He started choosing clips from different types of shows, sometimes comedies, sometimes dramas, sometimes documentaries about engineering topics. Each genre taught him different aspects of English communication. Comedies helped him understand humor and casual conversation. Dramas exposed him to emotional expression, and documentaries gave him practice with more formal, technical language. The real test came during a team meeting in his 4th month at the company. Sarah was explaining a new project timeline, and instead of struggling to follow her words, Marco found himself understanding not just the content, but also the subtle implications of what she was saying. When she mentioned that the deadline was quite tight, Marco understood that this meant it would be challenging to meet. When Michael said the schedule was ambitious, Marco recognized this as a diplomatic way of saying it might be unrealistic. For the first time since starting his job, Marco felt confident enough to contribute meaningfully to the discussion. He suggested a modification to the project phases based on his experience in Madrid, and his colleagues listened attentively and adopted his recommendation. After the meeting, Sarah told him his input was valuable and asked for his thoughts on several other aspects of the project. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Marco started joining his colleagues for lunch regularly, and even accepted an invitation to after-work drinks. He discovered that James had a passion for motorcycles, that Priya was planning a trip to Spain, and that Sarah had lived in Germany for 2 years. These weren't just pleasant conversations. They were the foundation of real workplace relationships. Marco's girlfriend Anna noticed the change during their phone calls. His confidence was completely different, and he even started mixing English expressions into their Spanish conversations without realizing it. When Anna visited London for the first time, she was amazed to see Marco chatting easily with shop assistants, ordering food in restaurants, and even making friends with their neighbors. The most important lesson from Marco's experience was that effective language learning requires depth, not breadth. Instead of trying to understand everything, he focused intensively on understanding specific content completely. Instead of learning isolated vocabulary words, he learned how words work together in natural speech patterns. Instead of studying about English, he practiced using English in realistic contexts. Now I'm going to teach you the technique that Marco used. Choose content that's 2 to 3 minutes long in English. It could be a podcast excerpt, a scene from a series, or even this episode. First, listen without pausing, just to get a general impression. Second, listen again and try to identify familiar words. Third, listen a third time and focus on connectors, those small words that link ideas together. Don't worry about understanding 100%. Focus on capturing the general meaning. This active listening technique is probably the most powerful tool I've discovered for developing real English comprehension. It's based on how your brain naturally processes language, working in layers rather than trying to decode everything at once. When I first started using this method with my students, I was amazed at how quickly they began to understand natural English speech, even students who had struggled with listening for years. The key to this technique is understanding that listening comprehension happens in stages, not all at once. Your brain needs multiple exposures to the same content to build connections between sounds and meanings. Most people make the mistake of listening to something once, getting frustrated when they don't understand everything, and then moving on to new content. This approach actually works against how your brain learns to process language. Let me walk you through exactly how to implement this technique, using practical examples that you can start with today. First, you need to select your content carefully. The ideal piece should be between 2 and 3 minutes long enough to contain natural conversation patterns, but short enough that you can listen to it multiple times without getting bored or overwhelmed. Your content should also be slightly above your current comprehension level. If you understand everything easily on the first listen, the material is too easy and won't challenge your brain to grow. If you understand almost nothing, it's too difficult and will just frustrate you. You want to aim for content where you can catch maybe 30 to 40% of the meaning on first listen. Good sources for this type of content include YouTube videos where people are having natural conversations, podcast interviews with clear audio quality, scenes from television shows or movies where characters are discussing everyday topics, or even recorded phone conversations between friends. Avoid heavily scripted content like news broadcasts or formal presentations, as these don't reflect the natural speech patterns you need to learn. Now let's go through each listening phase in detail. During your first listen, resist the urge to analyze or translate anything. Just let the English wash over you like background music. Your goal is to get a feel for the rhythm, pace, and emotional tone of the conversation. Don't try to catch individual words or figure out specific meanings. Instead, ask yourself general questions. Do the speakers sound happy or serious? Are they asking questions or making statements? Is this a formal or casual conversation? This first listen is training your ear to recognize English as a musical language with its own rhythm and flow. Native speakers use stress patterns, intonation changes, and timing to convey meaning, and your brain needs to become familiar with these patterns before it can effectively process the individual words. Many of my students are surprised to discover how much they can understand about a conversation's general meaning just from tone and rhythm, even when they can't identify specific vocabulary. During your second listen, your brain is ready to start connecting sounds to meanings. This time, focus on identifying words you definitely know. Don't worry about words you're unsure about. Just celebrate the ones you recognize clearly. You might notice that some words you know perfectly well in isolation are harder to identify when they're part of rapid speech. This is completely normal. Native speakers link words together, drop certain sounds, and use contractions that can make familiar vocabulary sound unfamiliar. Write down the words you recognize, but don't worry about getting them in the right order or understanding how they connect. At this stage, you're training your ear to pick out individual items from the stream of speech. You might write down words like going, tomorrow, meeting, coffee, think, without knowing how they fit together. That's perfect for this stage of the process. The magic happens during your third listen. Now your brain has had 2 exposures to the same content, and it's ready to start recognizing patterns and connections. This time, focus specifically on the small words that native speakers use to link their ideas together. Words like and, but, so, because, when, if, that, and which are crucial for understanding how thoughts connect to each other. These connector words are often the key to understanding the overall meaning of a conversation, even when you miss some of the main vocabulary. If you hear, I wanted to go, but, you know that something prevented the person from going, even if you don't catch what that something was. If you hear, we finished early, so, you know that finishing early led to some consequence or opportunity. During this third listen, you'll often experience what I call the puzzle click moment. Suddenly, pieces of the conversation start fitting together, and the general meaning becomes clear even though you didn't understand every word. This is exactly how native speakers process language. We don't decode every single word. We use context, patterns, and key vocabulary to construct meaning. After these 3 focused listens, you can listen a 4th time just to enjoy the content and notice how much more you understand compared to your first listen. Many students are shocked to discover that they can now follow the main ideas of a conversation that seemed completely incomprehensible just 20 minutes earlier. The beautiful thing about this technique is that it works with any English content you enjoy. If you love cooking shows, use cooking show clips. If you're interested in technology, find tech podcast segments. If you enjoy romantic comedies, practice with romantic comedy scenes. When you're genuinely interested in the topic, your brain is more motivated to decode the language. One of my students, Patricia from Milan, used this technique with clips from British baking shows because she loved cooking. After 6 weeks of practice, she told me she had started dreaming in English about baking recipes. Her brain had become so accustomed to processing English language patterns that it was continuing the work even while she slept. Remember, this technique works because it mirrors natural language acquisition. Children don't learn their first language by studying vocabulary lists or analyzing sentence structure. They learn through repeated exposure to meaningful speech and context, gradually building their understanding through multiple encounters with the same language patterns. The repetition isn't boring or wasteful. It's essential. Each time you listen, your brain is making new connections, recognizing new patterns, and strengthening existing neural pathways. You're literally rewiring your brain to process English more efficiently and naturally. Your brain needs repetition to create strong neural connections. When you hear the same phrase multiple times, it stops being strange and becomes familiar. It's like learning to ride a bicycle. At first, it seems impossible, but with practice, it becomes automatic. Don't be afraid to repeat the same content. Each time you listen, your brain processes new information. Repetition isn't monotony, it's building fluency. I want you to imagine your brain as a vast network of pathways, like a complex highway system. When you first encounter a new English phrase or expression, it's like trying to navigate through an unfamiliar city with no map. You might eventually reach your destination, but the journey is slow, uncertain, and requires enormous mental effort. However, each time you travel that same route, the path becomes clearer, more familiar, and easier to navigate. This is exactly what happens in your brain when you repeat English content. The first time you hear a phrase like, I was wondering if you could help me, your brain has to work hard to decode each word and figure out the meaning. But by the 5th or 6th time you encounter this phrase, your brain recognizes it as a complete unit of meaning. It stops being a puzzle to solve and becomes a familiar expression that you understand instantly. Many of my students resist repetition because they think it's boring or inefficient. They believe that listening to the same content multiple times is a waste of time when they could be exposing themselves to new vocabulary and expressions. This thinking is completely backwards. It's like trying to build a house by constantly buying new materials instead of actually putting the bricks together. Let me tell you about Isabella, a marketing professional from Florence who came to me with a common complaint. She had been listening to English podcasts for over a year, spending an hour every day consuming different content. Isabella was proud of the fact that she never listened to the same episode twice and was always seeking out new material. But despite all this exposure, she felt like her comprehension wasn't improving significantly. Isabella could catch fragments of conversations and understand isolated sentences, but she struggled to follow extended discussions or complex explanations. She felt like she was always one step behind, partially understanding what was being said, but missing the deeper connections and implications. When I suggested that she start repeating content instead of constantly seeking new material, she was skeptical. I explained to Isabella that her approach was like trying to learn a song by listening to a different piece of music every day. She might become familiar with various melodies and rhythms, but she would never really master any particular song. To truly internalize a song, you need to hear it multiple times until you can sing along naturally, until the melody becomes part of your musical memory. Reluctantly, Isabella agreed to try my approach. We selected a 10-minute interview with a successful entrepreneur discussing her business journey. Isabella listened to this same interview every day for 2 weeks, using the active listening technique I had taught her. At first, she found it tedious and worried that she wasn't learning anything new after the 3rd or 4th listen. But something remarkable happened around day 5. Isabella began noticing subtleties in the conversation that she had completely missed during her initial listens. She started picking up on the speaker's emotional tone when discussing challenges, understanding the humor in certain comments, and recognizing sophisticated vocabulary that had previously sounded like meaningless noise. By day 10, Isabella was not just understanding the content, she was anticipating what the speaker would say next. She had internalized the natural flow of the conversation, the speaker's communication style, and the logical progression of ideas. More importantly, she started using some of the phrases and expressions from the interview in her own conversations with English-speaking colleagues. The breakthrough came during week 3 when Isabella attended an international marketing conference in London. During a networking session, she found herself naturally using expressions she had heard dozens of times in her practice interview. Phrases like, "That's an interesting perspective," and "I hadn't thought about it that way," flowed effortlessly from her mouth. She wasn't translating from Italian or searching for words. She was communicating with natural English expressions that had become part of her active vocabulary. What Isabella discovered is that repetition doesn't just help you understand English better. It helps you internalize the natural patterns and rhythms of the language. When you hear the same conversations multiple times, you absorb not just the vocabulary and meaning, but also the musicality of English speech. You learn how native speakers use pauses, emphasis, and intonation to convey different emotions and meanings. Think about your favorite song in your native language. You probably know all the words by heart, not because you sat down and memorized the lyrics, but because you heard the song many times and enjoyed it. The repetition was pleasurable, not tedious, because you were emotionally connected to the music. The same principle applies to language learning. When you find English content that genuinely interests you and repeat it multiple times, the process becomes enjoyable rather than boring. This is why I always encourage my students to choose content they actually care about for their repetition practice. If you're fascinated by cooking, use cooking show segments. If you love technology, practice with tech podcast interviews. If you're interested in personal development, repeat motivational speeches or self-help audio content. When the subject matter engages you intellectually or emotionally, repetition feels less like work and more like deepening your connection with something meaningful. The science behind this approach is fascinating. Neuroscientists have discovered that repetition literally changes the structure of your brain. Each time you encounter the same language pattern, the neural pathways associated with that pattern become stronger and more efficient. This is called long-term potentiation, and it's the biological basis for all learning and memory formation. What's particularly interesting about language learning is that this neural strengthening happens even when you're not consciously aware of it. You might think you're not learning anything new during your 5th listen to the same content, but your brain is actually making thousands of micro-adjustments, fine-tuning its ability to process English sounds, patterns, and meanings. I often compare this process to learning to drive a car. When you first start driving, you have to consciously think about every action, checking mirrors, signaling, steering, braking. Each movement requires deliberate mental effort. But after months of practice, driving becomes automatic. Your brain has created such strong neural pathways for driving that you can navigate familiar routes while thinking about completely different things. Language fluency works the same way. Through repetition, English processing becomes automatic rather than effortful. Instead of consciously translating and analyzing everything you hear, your brain starts recognizing patterns and meanings directly. This is when you know you're approaching real fluency, when English comprehension feels effortless rather than exhausting. The key is to embrace repetition as a powerful learning tool rather than seeing it as a limitation. Every time you listen to the same content, you're not just reviewing old information. You're building the neural infrastructure that will allow you to understand new English content more easily in the future. One of the best ways to practice speaking is to talk to yourself. Yes, you heard that right. Choose a simple topic like your morning routine, describe your room, or talk about your favorite movie. Speak out loud for 2 minutes without stopping. Don't worry about mistakes. Focus on maintaining the flow of speech. Record yourself if you want, but the important thing is to create the habit of forming sentences in English naturally and spontaneously. I know this might sound strange or even embarrassing, but speaking to yourself is one of the most effective techniques for developing English fluency, and it's completely free. You don't need a conversation partner, you don't need to schedule appointments with tutors, and you don't need to worry about making mistakes in front of other people. Your only audience is yourself, which means you can experiment, make errors, and practice without any social pressure. When I first suggest this technique to my students, I usually get some puzzled looks. People often ask me, how can talking to myself possibly help me become more fluent? The answer lies in understanding how speaking confidence develops. Most people think that speaking skills improve through conversations with others, but actually, much of the mental work of language production happens internally, in your own mind. Think about it this way. Before you can have a smooth conversation with someone else, you need to be comfortable forming thoughts and expressing ideas in English inside your own head. If you struggle to organize your thoughts in English when you're alone and relaxed, it's going to be even more difficult when you're in a real conversation with the added pressure of responding quickly and appropriately to another person. Let me share the story of Carlos, a graphic designer from Seville who was preparing for a job interview at an international advertising agency in London. Carlos had excellent technical skills and an impressive portfolio, but he was terrified about the interview because he knew it would be conducted entirely in English. He had been studying English for years, but most of his practice had been reading and writing. He rarely spoke English out loud, and when he did, it was usually just short responses in class or brief exchanges with tourists. Carlos came to me 6 weeks before his interview, panic evident in his voice. He explained that he could understand English well and could write professional emails, but when it came to speaking spontaneously about his work and experience, he felt completely blocked. The words he knew perfectly well on paper seemed to disappear when he tried to speak them aloud. I introduced Carlos to solo speaking practice, and initially he was skeptical. He said it felt weird and artificial to talk to himself, and he didn't see how it could prepare him for a real interview situation. But I convinced him to try it for just 1 week, with a specific structure that would gradually build his confidence. We started with the simplest possible topics, things Carlos knew so well that he could discuss them in Spanish without any preparation. I asked him to spend 5 minutes every morning describing his breakfast routine in English, speaking continuously without worrying about perfection. The first few attempts were halting and full of long pauses, but Carlos persisted. Something interesting happened after just 3 days of this practice. Carlos noticed that certain phrases were starting to come more naturally. Instead of struggling to remember how to say, "I usually have coffee," the expression began flowing automatically. More importantly, he was becoming comfortable with the physical act of speaking English, the mouth movements, the rhythm, and the breathing patterns that are different from Spanish. After a week of breakfast descriptions, we expanded to other familiar topics. Carlos spent time describing his apartment, talking about his weekend activities, and explaining his daily work routine. Each topic built on the vocabulary and confidence from previous sessions, and gradually, his speaking became more fluid and natural. The real breakthrough came when Carlos started practicing responses to potential interview questions. Instead of just thinking about what he might say, he spoke his answers aloud, timing himself and working on maintaining a conversational flow. He practiced talking about his education, his work experience, his design philosophy, and his career goals. By the time of his interview, Carlos had spent hours talking to himself in English about topics relevant to his professional life. When the interviewer asked him to describe a challenging project he had worked on, Carlos was ready. The answer flowed naturally because he had practiced similar explanations dozens of times in the privacy of his own apartment. Carlos got the job, and when he called to thank me, he said something that perfectly captures the power of solo speaking practice. I realized that the conversation with the interviewer was actually easier than talking to myself, because she was asking me questions and giving me direction. When I practice alone, I have to generate everything: the topics, the transitions, the explanations, all by myself. This is exactly why solo speaking practice is so effective. When you talk to yourself, you're doing all the mental work of conversation, choosing topics, organizing thoughts, finding vocabulary, and maintaining flow, without any external support. It's like training for a marathon by running uphill with weights. When you finally get to the actual race on flat ground, it feels much easier by comparison. The key to effective solo speaking practice is choosing topics that genuinely interest you or relate to your life. Don't try to discuss abstract philosophical concepts or complex political issues if these topics don't naturally engage you. Instead, start with concrete, personal subjects that you could easily discuss in your native language. Here are some topic ideas that work well for beginners. Describe your hometown and what makes it special. Explain your job or studies to someone who knows nothing about your field. Talk about a hobby you enjoy and why it interests you. Describe your family and what they're like. Explain your favorite recipe and how to prepare it, or discuss a trip you took and what made it memorable. The most important rule for solo speaking practice is to keep talking, even when you don't know the exact word you want to use. This is where the real magic happens. When you can't think of a specific vocabulary word, you learn to explain the concept using simpler words you do know. This skill, being able to communicate ideas even when your vocabulary is limited, is absolutely crucial for real-world English communication. For example, if you can't remember the word exhausted, you might say, very, very tired, or so tired I could barely move. If you forget fascinating, you could say, really interesting, or something that made me want to learn more. Native speakers do this all the time when they can't think of the perfect word, and it's a sign of communication competence, not vocabulary weakness. Recording yourself during these solo speaking sessions can be incredibly valuable, but it's not essential. Some students find that recording helps them notice patterns in their speech and track their progress over time. Others find that knowing they're being recorded makes them more self-conscious and less willing to take risks with their language. Sofia lived in Lisbon and dreamed of doing her master's degree in the United States. She was afraid to speak English because she thought her accent was too strong and that people wouldn't understand her. Sofia had been practicing grammar for years, but avoided real conversations. One day, she decided to challenge herself. She started recording voice messages for herself in English, as if she were talking to an American friend. In the beginning, they were just 30 seconds of hesitant speech. Sofia's story is one that resonates with so many of my students, particularly those from countries where English isn't widely spoken in daily life. She had grown up in a traditional Portuguese education system where English was taught primarily through textbooks and written exercises. For 8 years, from middle school through university, Sofia had studied English grammar rules, memorized vocabulary lists, and completed countless fill-in-the-blank exercises. By the time Sofia graduated with her bachelor's degree in international relations, she could read English academic papers with ease, write sophisticated essays, and score high marks on standardized tests. Her professors praised her written English as being nearly at native level. Sofia felt confident about her English abilities on paper, and she began researching master's programs at prestigious American universities. But there was one enormous problem that Sofia kept trying to ignore. She had never had a real conversation in English with a native speaker. Every time she imagined herself in an American classroom, participating in discussions and giving presentations, she felt a wave of panic. What if her classmates couldn't understand her Portuguese accent? What if professors found her pronunciation distracting? What if she couldn't express her ideas quickly enough during fast-paced seminars? These fears weren't entirely irrational. Sofia had heard herself speaking English in class, and she knew her accent was quite strong. When she pronounced words like university or international, they sounded distinctly Portuguese to her own ears. She worried that American students would need to concentrate extra hard to understand her, making her feel like a burden in group discussions. The anxiety became particularly acute when Sofia started watching videos of American university classes online. The students spoke so quickly and naturally, jumping into discussions without hesitation, making jokes, and expressing complex ideas with apparent ease. Sofia felt like she was watching a different species of human being, one that could navigate the English language with a confidence she couldn't imagine possessing herself. For months, Sofia postponed taking the required speaking tests for her university applications. She told herself she needed more preparation, more practice, more confidence. But the truth was, she was terrified of hearing her own voice speaking English and discovering that her fears about her accent were justified. She spent hours perfecting her written application essays, but avoided any situation that would require her to speak English aloud. The turning point came during a conversation with her cousin Miguel, who had been living in London for 3 years. Miguel visited Lisbon for Christmas, and Sofia was surprised to hear how confidently he spoke English during a phone call with his British girlfriend. His accent was still recognizably Portuguese, but he communicated effortlessly, laughing and joking and expressing himself naturally. After the call, Sofia asked Miguel how he had overcome his fear of speaking English with a Portuguese accent. His response surprised her. "I never overcame it. I just started talking anyway." Miguel explained that his first few months in London had been challenging, but people understood him just fine, even with his accent. He had learned that communication was about getting your message across, not about sounding like someone you weren't. Inspired by Miguel's example, Sofia decided to take action, but in a way that felt safe and private. She came up with the idea of recording voice messages for herself, imagining that she was talking to an American friend she had never met. This approach allowed her to practice speaking English without the pressure of real-time interaction or the fear of being judged by others. Sofia's first recording was painful to listen to. She spent nearly 5 minutes trying to record a simple 30-second introduction, restarting multiple times when she stumbled over words or felt dissatisfied with her pronunciation. When she finally managed to complete a short message introducing herself and explaining her interest in studying in America, her voice sounded shaky and uncertain to her own ears. But Sofia forced herself to listen to the recording without deleting it. She noticed that while her accent was indeed strong, her message was completely understandable. The words were clear, the meaning was obvious, and even though she paused frequently to search for vocabulary, her ideas came across effectively. Encouraged by this small success, Sofia committed to recording one voice message every day. She created an imaginary friend named Jennifer and began having one-sided conversations with her about daily life in Lisbon. Sofia would describe her classes, talk about Portuguese culture, explain her career goals, and share her thoughts about moving to America. These daily recordings became a safe space for Sofia to experiment with English expression. She could try out new vocabulary, practice different ways of explaining the same idea, and gradually become more comfortable with the sound of her own voice speaking English. If she made mistakes or felt embarrassed by her pronunciation, she could simply delete the recording and try again. After 2 weeks of daily voice messages, Sofia noticed that her speaking was becoming more fluid. She was pausing less frequently to search for words, and she was starting to speak in longer, more connected sentences rather than short, choppy phrases. More importantly, she was beginning to develop her own English-speaking personality, a version of herself that felt authentic even while speaking a foreign language. The real breakthrough came when Sofia decided to record herself explaining why she wanted to study international relations in America. This was the kind of response she would need to give during university interviews, and she had been dreading the prospect of answering such questions spontaneously in English. To her amazement, the words flowed more easily than she had expected. Sofia found herself speaking passionately about her academic interests, her career goals, and her excitement about experiencing American university culture. When she listened to the recording, she heard something she had never heard before: herself sounding genuinely confident and articulate in English. Sofia gradually increased the time of her recordings. First 1 minute, then 2, until she reached 5-minute conversations on various topics. She noticed her mistakes in the recordings, but instead of criticizing herself, she saw them as opportunities for improvement. Sofia also began imitating the intonation and rhythm of native speakers. When she finally had her first real conversation in English, she was surprised. The person understood everything she said. The accent didn't matter, communication happened. The transformation in Sofia's approach was remarkable to witness, even though I only learned about it months later when she contacted me for additional coaching. What had started as 30-second bursts of nervous English had evolved into confident, extended monologues about complex topics. Sofia's method of gradually extending her recording time was brilliant because it allowed her to build stamina and confidence incrementally, without overwhelming herself. During her second month of practice, Sofia moved from 1-minute recordings to 2-minute sessions. This seemingly small increase actually represented a significant challenge because it required her to sustain her thoughts and maintain conversational flow for twice as long. At first, Sofia found herself running out of things to say after about 90 seconds, but she forced herself to keep talking anyway, even if it meant repeating ideas or going off on tangents. This practice of continuing to speak even when she felt she had nothing more to say turned out to be incredibly valuable. Sofia learned to expand on her ideas, provide examples, and make connections between different thoughts, skills that are essential for academic discussions and professional conversations. She was unknowingly training herself to think and elaborate in English, rather than simply translating preformed thoughts from Portuguese. By the third month, Sofia was regularly recording 5-minute sessions on topics ranging from Portuguese politics to her favorite books to her opinions about American culture. These longer recordings required her to organize her thoughts more systematically and to develop her ideas more thoroughly. She began structuring her monologues with introductions, main points, and conclusions, essentially practicing the kind of extended speaking she would need for university presentations. What impressed me most about Sofia's story was her attitude toward mistakes. In the beginning, like most language learners, she had been devastated every time she heard herself make an error in her recordings. She would often delete entire sessions because of a single mispronounced word or an awkward phrase. But gradually, Sofia's relationship with her mistakes began to change. She started keeping a notebook where she would write down interesting errors she noticed in her recordings, not to criticize herself, but to understand patterns in her speech and to track her improvement over time. Sofia discovered that many of her mistakes were actually systematic. She consistently mispronounced certain types of words or struggled with specific sentence structures. Instead of feeling embarrassed about these patterns, she saw them as roadmaps for focused improvement. For example, Sofia noticed that she often confused the pronunciation of words ending in ation, like education and communication. Instead of simply feeling bad about this mistake, she spent a week focusing specifically on these types of words, recording herself saying them correctly and practicing them in different sentence contexts. This targeted approach was much more effective than random vocabulary study. Sofia also began paying attention to the rhythm and melody of English speech in a way she had never done before. She started listening carefully to English podcasts and YouTube videos, not just for content understanding, but for the musical patterns of the language. She noticed how native speakers used pauses, stress, and intonation to make their speech more engaging and easier to follow. Fascinated by these discoveries, Sofia began experimenting with copying the speaking patterns she heard. After listening to a particularly articulate podcast host, she would try to mimic not just the words, but the rhythm and tone of the speaker. This practice helped Sofia understand that English fluency wasn't just about getting the words right. It was about making the language come alive through natural rhythm and expression. The breakthrough she had been working toward came unexpectedly during a chance encounter at Lisbon Airport. Sofia was waiting for a flight to Madrid when she overheard an American tourist struggling to communicate with airport staff about a delayed connection. The tourist looked frustrated and confused, and Sofia felt a sudden impulse to help. Without giving herself time to feel nervous, Sofia approached the American woman and offered assistance. She explained the delay situation, helped the tourist understand her rebooking options, and even recommended a good restaurant in the airport for the extended layover. The conversation lasted about 10 minutes and covered practical logistics, cultural differences, and personal travel experiences. Only after the American woman thanked her warmly and walked away did Sofia realize what had just happened. She had conducted an extended, spontaneous conversation in English with a native speaker, and it had felt completely natural. The woman had understood everything Sofia said, had never asked for clarification, and had seemed genuinely grateful for the help. More importantly, Sofia noticed that she hadn't been thinking about her accent during the conversation. She had been focused entirely on communication, understanding the woman's problem and providing helpful information. Her Portuguese accent was still there, of course, but it hadn't prevented successful communication in any way. This experience was transformational for Sofia because it proved something she had begun to suspect during her months of recording practice. Accent matters much less than clarity, confidence, and genuine desire to communicate. The American tourist had been interested in Sofia's message, not her pronunciation. She had been grateful for the information and assistance, not judgmental about linguistic perfection. Energized by this success, Sofia finally felt ready to take her university entrance interviews. She scheduled speaking tests with 3 different American universities, approaching them with newfound confidence. The interviews went remarkably well. Admissions officers commented on Sofia's articulate explanations of her academic interests and her thoughtful questions about their programs. Most surprisingly to Sofia, none of the interviewers seemed to have any difficulty understanding her English. What she had worried would be a barrier to communication turned out to be simply a characteristic of her speech, like having brown eyes or being tall. It was part of who she was, but it didn't interfere with her ability to express complex ideas or engage in meaningful academic discussions. Sofia received acceptance letters from 2 of the 3 universities she had applied to, along with partial scholarship offers. When she moved to Washington, D.C. to begin her master's program, she carried with her not just strong academic preparation, but also the confidence that had grown from months of patient, persistent practice with her voice recording method. Her American classmates did indeed notice that she spoke English with a Portuguese accent, but their reactions were uniformly positive. Many expressed admiration for her multilingual abilities and curiosity about Portuguese culture. Sofia's accent became a conversation starter rather than a barrier, helping her build friendships and establish her unique identity within the international student community. Shadowing is a powerful technique where you listen to audio and try to repeat at the same time, like a shadow. Choose content you already know well. Start speaking along even if you can't keep up completely. Gradually, your brain will synchronize with the rhythm and intonation of native English. This technique simultaneously develops your listening, speaking, pronunciation, and natural rhythm of the language. Practice 10 minutes a day and see the difference. Shadowing is perhaps the most underrated technique in English learning, yet it's used by professional interpreters and translators around the world to maintain and improve their language skills. The concept is beautifully simple. You listen to English audio and attempt to speak along simultaneously, matching the pace, rhythm, and intonation as closely as possible. Think of it as becoming the linguistic shadow of a native speaker. What makes shadowing so effective is that it forces your brain to process English at natural speed while simultaneously coordinating your speech muscles to produce the sounds you're hearing. This dual challenge creates a kind of intensive training that develops multiple language skills at once. Your ear becomes more attuned to natural pronunciation patterns. Your mouth learns to move in ways that produce more native-like sounds, and your brain develops the ability to process and produce English simultaneously, rather than sequentially. I first discovered the power of shadowing when I was working with Emma, a software engineer from Berlin who had moved to Dublin for work. Emma had excellent technical English vocabulary and could communicate effectively in professional settings, but she felt self-conscious about her pronunciation and rhythm when speaking English. Her colleagues were always patient and understanding, but Emma noticed that she had to repeat herself more often than native speakers did, and she suspected her pronunciation was the issue. Emma's challenge was particularly interesting because her English vocabulary and sentence structure were actually quite sophisticated. She could explain complex technical concepts clearly and accurately. The problem wasn't what she was saying, but how she was saying it. Her German accent was quite strong, but more importantly, she was applying German rhythm and stress patterns to English words, making her speech sound choppy and unnatural to native English ears. When I introduced Emma to shadowing practice, she was skeptical at first. The technique seemed almost silly to her logical, engineering-oriented mind. How could simply repeating after audio recordings possibly improve her pronunciation more effectively than studying phonetics or taking pronunciation classes? But Emma agreed to try the method for 2 weeks before making any judgments about its effectiveness. We started with content Emma already knew well. TED Talks she had watched multiple times about technology and innovation. This was crucial because shadowing works best when you're already familiar with the content. If you're struggling to understand what's being said, you can't focus on mimicking the pronunciation and rhythm. The goal is to let meaning take care of itself so you can concentrate entirely on the sounds and patterns of the language. Emma's first shadowing session was challenging and somewhat frustrating. She chose a 10-minute TED Talk by a British speaker discussing artificial intelligence. As she attempted to speak along with the presenter, Emma quickly realized how difficult it was to match the natural pace of native English speech. She found herself falling behind, stumbling over words, and feeling like her mouth couldn't keep up with what her ears were hearing. But I encouraged Emma to persist, reminding her that the goal wasn't perfect synchronization immediately. The goal was gradual improvement in her ability to match natural English rhythm and pronunciation patterns. Even if she could only shadow successfully for a few seconds at a time, her brain was learning valuable information about how English really sounds when spoken naturally. After just 1 week of daily 10-minute shadowing sessions, Emma began noticing changes in her regular speaking. Her colleagues commented that she seemed more confident in meetings, and she realized that she was unconsciously incorporating some of the rhythm patterns she had been practicing. Words that had always felt awkward in her mouth were starting to flow more naturally. The breakthrough came during Emma's 3rd week of practice. She was shadowing a conversation between 2 American speakers discussing startup culture, and suddenly she realized she was keeping up with about 70% of the dialogue without conscious effort. Her mouth was automatically forming the sounds, her breathing was naturally synchronizing with the speaker's pauses, and she was matching their stress patterns without thinking about it. What happened to Emma illustrates the neurological magic of shadowing practice. When you attempt to speak simultaneously with native speakers, your brain creates direct connections between hearing English sounds and producing them. This bypasses the analytical process that most learners use, where they hear a sound, consciously think about how to produce it, then attempt to make that sound with their mouth. The beauty of shadowing is that it works with your brain's natural language learning mechanisms rather than against them. Children learning their first language engage in a form of shadowing when they repeat songs, nursery rhymes, and phrases they hear from adults. They're not analyzing the sounds intellectually. They're simply mimicking what they hear until it becomes natural and automatic. For adult language learners, shadowing recreates this natural learning process. Your brain stops overthinking pronunciation and starts developing automatic responses to English sound patterns. You begin to internalize the music of the language, its rhythm, stress patterns, and intonational melodies, in a way that no amount of theoretical study can achieve. The key to effective shadowing practice is choosing appropriate material and progressing systematically. Begin with content you know extremely well, perhaps English songs you've heard dozens of times or scenes from movies you've watched repeatedly. The familiarity with content allows you to focus entirely on pronunciation and rhythm rather than comprehension. Start with shorter segments, perhaps just 2 or 3 minutes of audio, and don't worry about keeping up with every single word. Focus on matching the overall rhythm and flow rather than perfect pronunciation of individual sounds. As you become more comfortable, gradually increase the length and complexity of your shadowing material. One particularly effective approach is to shadow the same piece of content multiple times over several days. Each repetition allows your brain to refine its understanding of the pronunciation patterns and improve its ability to coordinate listening and speaking simultaneously. You'll often find that passages that seemed impossibly fast on day 1 become quite manageable by day 3 or 4. Emma continued her shadowing practice for several months, gradually progressing from familiar TED Talks to podcast interviews, from scripted presentations to natural conversations. The cumulative effect was remarkable. Her Irish colleagues began commenting that her English sounded much more natural, and she stopped needing to repeat herself in meetings. More importantly, Emma felt genuinely confident about her spoken English for the first time since moving to Dublin. The technique works because it trains your mouth, ear, and brain simultaneously. Your mouth learns to make English sounds more naturally, your ear becomes more sensitive to the subtle details of native pronunciation, and your brain develops automatic pathways for English sound production. This integrated approach is far more effective than practicing these skills separately. Regular shadowing practice also helps you internalize the natural connected speech patterns that make English sound fluid rather than choppy. You learn how native speakers link words together, which sounds get reduced in rapid speech, and how stress and intonation convey meaning beyond just the individual words being spoken. Instead of focusing on isolated words, learn chunks, groups of words that natives use together. For example, instead of learning just take, learn take care, take your time, take a break. These chunks make your speech more natural and fluid. When you listen to English, pay attention to these repetitive combinations. Your brain will start to recognize patterns, and you'll sound more native automatically. This concept of language chunks revolutionized my own language learning journey and has become one of the most powerful techniques I share with my students. Most traditional language teaching focuses on individual vocabulary words and then expects learners to combine them creatively into sentences, but this approach completely misses how native speakers actually use language. We don't think in terms of individual words that we then assemble like building blocks. Instead, we think in terms of ready-made phrases and expressions that we've heard and used thousands of times. Think about how you use your native language for a moment. When you want to express gratitude, you don't construct a sentence by selecting individual words like I, appreciate, your, help. Instead, you automatically use complete phrases like thanks so much, or I really appreciate it, or that's very kind of you. These phrases come to you as complete units, and you don't have to think about their internal structure or word order. This is exactly how native English speakers communicate. They have thousands of these ready-made chunks stored in their mental vocabulary, and they combine these chunks to express complex ideas quickly and naturally. When a native speaker says something like, I was wondering if you could help me out, they're not constructing that sentence word by word. They're using a familiar chunk for making polite requests that they've heard and used countless times before. I discovered the power of chunk learning when I was working with Alessandro, a chef from Milan who had moved to London to work in a high-end restaurant. Alessandro had studied English for years and had an impressive vocabulary of individual words, especially related to cooking and food preparation. He could name dozens of ingredients, cooking techniques, and kitchen equipment in English. But when he tried to communicate with his English-speaking colleagues during busy service periods, he struggled terribly. The problem wasn't Alessandro's vocabulary knowledge. It was how he was trying to use that vocabulary. He would construct sentences by translating from Italian word by word, which created awkward, unnatural-sounding English that his colleagues found difficult to follow quickly. For example, when he wanted to ask a colleague to help him prepare vegetables, Alessandro might say something like, "Can you make assistance to me for cutting the vegetables?" This is grammatically understandable, but it's not how native speakers would naturally express that idea. When I introduced Alessandro to chunk-based learning, everything changed. Instead of learning isolated cooking vocabulary, we focused on the complete phrases that restaurant workers actually use. Instead of just knowing the word prepare, Alessandro learned chunks like prep the vegetables, get the mise en place ready, fire the appetizers, and plate it up nicely. These weren't just vocabulary items, they were complete communication tools that he could use immediately in real workplace situations. The transformation was remarkable. Within just 2 weeks of focusing on restaurant-specific chunks, Alessandro was communicating much more effectively during service. His requests became clear and natural-sounding. Can you help me prep these vegetables? Or, I need to get the sauce ready for table 6. His colleagues understood him immediately, and the communication flow in the kitchen improved dramatically. What made this approach so effective was that Alessandro was learning language the way it's actually used in context, rather than learning abstract vocabulary that he then had to figure out how to combine. Each chunk he learned was immediately useful and could be applied directly to his daily work situations. This same principle applies to every area of English communication. In business contexts, native speakers use chunks like, thanks for reaching out, let's schedule a meeting, I wanted to follow up on, and please let me know if you have any questions. In social situations, they use chunks like, how's it going, what have you been up to, it was great seeing you, and let's keep in touch. These phrases function as complete communication units that express common ideas efficiently and naturally. The beauty of learning chunks is that they carry not just meaning, but also the appropriate tone and register for different situations. When you learn the chunk, I was wondering if you're not just learning a way to make requests, you're learning a polite, tentative way to make requests that's appropriate for formal or semi-formal situations. This is cultural and pragmatic information that you simply cannot get from learning individual words. One of my most successful chunk learning students was Maria, a marketing manager from Barcelona who needed to participate in international video conferences for her job. Maria had strong English vocabulary and could write excellent emails, but she felt tongue-tied during live meetings. She would often pause mid-sentence, searching for the right words to express her ideas, which made her contributions feel stilted and hesitant. We identified the most common functions Maria needed to perform during meetings, agreeing with others, expressing different opinions, asking for clarification, and making suggestions. Then, instead of working on vocabulary, we focused on learning complete chunks for each of these functions. For agreeing, Maria learned chunks like, that's a good point, I think you're absolutely right, and I couldn't agree more. For expressing different views, she learned, I see it a bit differently. Another way to look at it might be, and have we considered the possibility that? The impact was immediate and dramatic. In her next international meeting, Maria found herself participating much more naturally. Instead of constructing sentences word by word, she was using these ready-made chunks to express her ideas fluently. Her colleagues commented that she seemed much more confident and articulate, and Maria herself felt a huge difference in her ability to contribute meaningfully to discussions. The key to successful chunk learning is paying attention to how native speakers actually combine words when you listen to English content. Instead of focusing on individual vocabulary items, listen for repeated patterns and phrases. You'll start noticing that certain words almost always appear together in specific combinations. Words like make appear in chunks like make sense, make progress, make an effort, and make a difference. The word get appears in chunks like get started, get ready, get along, and get the hang of it. When you encounter these chunks repeatedly in different contexts, your brain begins to store them as complete units rather than as collections of individual words. This is exactly how children acquire their first language. They learn phrases and expressions as wholes, gradually understanding their internal structure through repeated exposure and use. Effective chunk learning requires a shift in how you approach English input. When you're listening to podcasts, watching videos, or having conversations, start paying attention to repeated word combinations rather than focusing solely on individual vocabulary. Keep a notebook where you write down interesting chunks you encounter, along with the context where you heard them. Review these chunks regularly and practice using them in your own speaking and writing. Stop being afraid of making mistakes. Each mistake is a step on the ladder of fluency. When you make an error and notice it, your brain creates a stronger connection with the correct form. Native speakers also make mistakes and correct themselves naturally. The important thing is to keep communication flowing. If you don't know a word, use other words to explain the idea. Creativity in communication is more valuable than grammatical perfection. This mindset shift about mistakes might be the most important change you can make in your English learning journey. I've watched thousands of students transform from hesitant, error-phobic learners into confident, expressive communicators simply by changing their relationship with mistakes. The fear of making errors is probably the single biggest obstacle that prevents people from reaching fluency, yet it's completely unnecessary and counterproductive. Let me tell you about Roberto, a brilliant architect from Rome who came to me with a frustrating problem. Roberto could design stunning buildings, manage complex construction projects, and present detailed architectural plans to clients in Italian. But when international clients visited his firm, Roberto would practically disappear. He understood English well, could read technical documents without difficulty, and had an impressive vocabulary. But he was so terrified of making mistakes that he barely spoke during meetings. Roberto's fear wasn't irrational, it was learned. Throughout his English education, mistakes had been treated as failures. Red marks on tests, corrections in class, and emphasis on getting everything right had taught him that errors were embarrassing signs of incompetence. This perfectionist mindset served him well in architecture, where precision matters enormously, but it was paralyzing his language development. The breakthrough came when I showed Roberto recordings of famous architects giving presentations at international conferences. We watched Norman Foster, Zaha Hadid, and Tadao Ando speaking English to global audiences. What Roberto noticed surprised him. These world-renowned architects, speaking to thousands of people, made small errors regularly. Foster occasionally searched for words, Hadid sometimes corrected herself mid-sentence, and Ando spoke with a strong Japanese accent that required careful listening. But here's what was remarkable. The audiences weren't focused on these speakers' linguistic imperfections. They were captivated by the architectural ideas being presented. The passion, creativity, and expertise came through clearly despite, or perhaps even because of, the human imperfections in the language delivery. These speakers weren't trying to sound like English teachers. They were being authentic professionals sharing their knowledge and vision. This revelation changed everything for Roberto. He realized that his international clients weren't coming to his firm to evaluate his English proficiency. They were coming to see his architectural expertise. His job wasn't to speak perfect English, it was to communicate his professional knowledge effectively, even if that communication wasn't linguistically flawless. Roberto began practicing a completely different approach to English communication. Instead of preparing perfect sentences in advance, he focused on expressing his ideas using whatever language resources he had available. When he didn't know the exact technical term for something, instead of stopping the conversation or feeling embarrassed, he would describe the concept using simpler words he did know. For example, When discussing sustainable building materials with a Canadian client, Roberto couldn't remember the English term for a specific type of insulation. Instead of panicking or apologizing for his vocabulary limitation, he said, "It's a material that keeps heat inside the building, made from recycled paper. Very good for the environment." The client understood perfectly and was actually impressed by Roberto's creative explanation and environmental consciousness. This experience taught Roberto something crucial. Communication is about transferring ideas from one mind to another, not about demonstrating linguistic perfection. When he stopped worrying about making mistakes and started focusing on sharing his architectural knowledge, his English became much more effective and natural. The neuroscience behind mistake-based learning is fascinating. When you make an error and then encounter or discover the correct form, your brain creates multiple pathways to the right information. The contrast between the incorrect attempt and the correct form actually strengthens your memory of the right way to say something. This is why students who actively use English and make mistakes often progress faster than students who study passively and avoid error-making situations. Think about how you learned to ride a bicycle or drive a car. You didn't become proficient by studying theory until you could perform perfectly. You learned by trying, making mistakes, getting feedback, and trying again. Each wobble on the bicycle and each imperfect turn while driving taught your brain and body important information about balance, steering, and coordination. Language learning works the same way. Your speaking skills develop through practice, including imperfect practice. Native speakers make mistakes constantly, and they have sophisticated strategies for dealing with these errors without interrupting communication flow. They use filler words like and when they need time to think. They restart sentences when they realize they're heading in the wrong direction. They use phrases like, "what I mean is," and in other words, to clarify or correct their initial attempts. They ask questions like, "does that make sense?" to check whether their communication was successful. These mistake management strategies are actually signs of communicative competence, not linguistic weakness. They show that a speaker prioritizes successful communication over perfect performance. When you develop similar strategies in English, you become a more effective communicator, not a less competent one. I worked with Francesca, a marketing director from Milan, who was initially mortified every time she made an English mistake during international video calls. She would apologize profusely, become flustered, and often lose track of her main points. Her Italian colleagues started avoiding putting her on international calls because her anxiety about errors made meetings less efficient. We worked on developing Francesca's mistake management skills. Instead of apologizing for errors, she learned to simply correct herself and continue speaking. Instead of getting flustered when she couldn't find the right word, she learned to say things like, "I'm looking for the word that means," or "how do you say when a company..." These phrases bought her time to think while keeping the conversation moving forward. The transformation was remarkable. Within 2 months, Francesca was leading international marketing calls with confidence. She still made mistakes, everyone does, but she had learned to handle them gracefully without derailing her communication effectiveness. Her colleagues began requesting her specifically for international projects because of her improved English communication skills. One of the most valuable mistake management techniques is learning to paraphrase when you don't know specific vocabulary. Instead of getting stuck on a word you can't remember, describe the concept using words you do know. This skill actually makes you a more effective communicator in any language, including your native language, because it demonstrates creative thinking and adaptability. For instance, if you can't remember the word pharmaceutical, you can say companies that make medicine. If you forget procrastinate, you can say delay doing something you should do. If you can't recall enthusiastic, you can say very excited about something. These paraphrases communicate your meaning clearly while demonstrating resourcefulness rather than limitation. The goal isn't to eliminate mistakes. That's impossible and unnecessary. The goal is to become comfortable making mistakes, learning from them, and continuing to communicate effectively despite them. This mindset shift transforms mistakes from obstacles into learning opportunities, from sources of embarrassment into natural parts of the language development process. Alessandro was an Italian chef who moved to Paris to work in an international restaurant. The team spoke English during work, and Alessandro felt intimidated because he thought his English wasn't good enough. He understood written recipes, but in the fast conversations of the kitchen, he got lost. Alessandro decided to transform his work environment into his English classroom. He began paying attention to phrases that repeated daily in the kitchen. Alessandro had always been passionate about cooking, but his dream was to work in one of the world's great culinary capitals. When he received an offer from a prestigious restaurant in Paris that served an international clientele, he knew this was his chance to take his career to the next level. The restaurant's reputation was built on innovation, precision, and the ability to serve guests from around the world, which meant the kitchen staff communicated primarily in English during service. Before starting his new position, Alessandro felt reasonably confident about his English abilities. He had studied the language in school, could read cooking magazines and recipe books written in English, and understood food-related vocabulary quite well. He had even watched English-language cooking shows and felt like he could follow the techniques being demonstrated. Alessandro assumed that his combination of culinary expertise and basic English knowledge would be sufficient for success in his new role. However, Alessandro's first day in the Paris kitchen was a wake-up call. The reality of professional kitchen communication was completely different from anything he had experienced before. During busy service periods, his colleagues spoke rapidly, used specialized kitchen slang, and communicated with an urgency and efficiency that left Alessandro feeling completely lost. When the head chef called out instructions like "fire table 6" or "how long on the lamb," Alessandro found himself frozen, unsure whether these were questions directed at him or general announcements. When a colleague asked him to plate up the appetizers for table 12, Alessandro understood the individual words but couldn't process the meaning quickly enough to respond appropriately. The pace of communication was relentless, and there was no time for translation or careful consideration of vocabulary. The most challenging aspect for Alessandro wasn't understanding formal cooking instructions, which were often similar to the written recipes he knew well. The real difficulty came with the informal, rapid-fire communication that happens during busy service periods. Colleagues would shout things like, "behind you," "sharp knife coming through," "sauce is breaking," or "we're in the weeds." These phrases were crucial for kitchen safety and efficiency, but they weren't covered in any English textbook Alessandro had studied. After several days of feeling confused and ineffective, Alessandro realized he needed to completely change his approach to learning English. Instead of studying general English vocabulary at home after exhausting shifts, he decided to treat his workplace as an intensive English learning laboratory. He would learn the language he actually needed, in the context where he needed to use it, from the people he worked with every day. Alessandro began carrying a small notebook during his shifts, not to write down recipes, but to record the English phrases he heard repeatedly throughout each day. He noticed that certain expressions appeared in every service period, often multiple times. Phrases like "pick up table 7," "where's the sauce for table 3," "we need more of these appetizers," and "table 15 is still waiting" were part of the daily rhythm of kitchen communication. What fascinated Alessandro was discovering that much of kitchen English consisted of these predictable, repeated phrases rather than complex or sophisticated vocabulary. The language was functional and efficient, designed to communicate essential information quickly and clearly during high-pressure situations. Once Alessandro started paying attention to these patterns, he realized that mastering maybe 50 or 60 key phrases would dramatically improve his ability to participate in kitchen communication. Alessandro's approach was systematic and practical. Each day, he would focus on learning 3 or 4 phrases he had heard repeatedly during service. Instead of trying to memorize them through repetition at home, he would practice using them in context during actual work situations. When he heard a colleague say, "how long on the fish for table 9," Alessandro would repeat the phrase quietly to himself, paying attention to the rhythm and pronunciation. The breakthrough came when Alessandro started anticipating these common phrases and preparing to use them himself. Instead of waiting for others to ask about order status, he began proactively communicating about his own stations. When he saw appetizers ready for pickup, he would call out, "apps up for table 6." When he needed assistance, he would ask, "can someone help me plate these?" When orders were taking longer than expected, he would communicate, "lamb needs 2 more minutes for table 12." This proactive approach had multiple benefits. Alessandro was no longer just trying to understand what others were saying. He was actively participating in the communication flow that keeps a professional kitchen operating smoothly. His colleagues began to see him as a valuable team member rather than someone who needed extra patience and assistance. More importantly, Alessandro felt genuinely integrated into the kitchen culture for the first time since starting his new job. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Alessandro discovered that learning English in context, with immediate practical application, was far more effective than any classroom or textbook study he had ever done. The phrases he learned in the kitchen became permanently embedded in his active vocabulary because he used them dozens of times each day in meaningful situations. Alessandro also began noticing that his general English comprehension was improving rapidly. The confidence he gained from mastering kitchen-specific communication gave him courage to engage in broader conversations with his colleagues. During break times, he started asking questions about their backgrounds, their cooking experiences, and their life outside the restaurant. These informal conversations exposed Alessandro to more casual English and helped him build genuine relationships with his coworkers. What surprised Alessandro most was how much cultural learning happened alongside language learning. Through daily English conversations with colleagues from different countries, he gained insights into various cooking traditions, cultural attitudes toward food, and professional practices from around the world. His English wasn't just improving as a communication tool, it was opening doors to a richer, more international perspective on his craft. The success of Alessandro's workplace-based approach inspired him to apply similar strategies to other areas of his life in Paris. He started paying attention to repeated phrases in grocery stores, cafes, and other daily environments, gradually building his practical English vocabulary through real-world exposure rather than academic study. Alessandro created a mental notebook of the most used expressions in the restaurant. At home, he practiced these phrases until they became automatic. He also began asking simple questions to colleagues during work, even when he knew the answer. This created natural conversation opportunities. In 3 months, Alessandro was not only participating in conversations, but also making jokes in English. He discovered that real context accelerates learning much more than studying alone. Alessandro's systematic approach to collecting and practicing restaurant phrases became the foundation for his rapid English improvement. Every evening after service, he would mentally review the expressions he had heard most frequently during the day. Instead of writing them down in a traditional notebook, Alessandro created what he called his mental phrase bank, a collection of essential kitchen communications that he would rehearse until they became second nature. This mental rehearsal process was crucial because Alessandro understood that kitchen communication happens too quickly for conscious thought. When someone shouted "behind you hot" during a busy service, there wasn't time to translate or analyze the phrase. The warning needed to be understood and acknowledged instantaneously for safety reasons. Alessandro realized that these essential phrases had to become automatic responses, as natural as his native Italian kitchen vocabulary. At home in his small Parisian apartment, Alessandro would practice these phrases out loud, paying careful attention to pronunciation and rhythm. He discovered that English kitchen communication had its own particular cadence, short, sharp, and efficient. Phrases like "order up," "table 6 away," and "sauce on the side" needed to be delivered with the right stress patterns and timing to be effective in the high-energy kitchen environment. What made Alessandro's practice sessions particularly effective was that he didn't just repeat the phrases mechanically. Instead, he recreated realistic kitchen scenarios in his mind, imagining specific situations where each phrase would be used. When practicing "how long on the steaks," he would visualize the head chef asking about timing for a specific table. When rehearsing "I need a hand with these plates," he would imagine being overwhelmed during a busy service period and needing assistance from colleagues. This contextual practice helped Alessandro understand not just what the phrases meant, but when and how to use them appropriately. English kitchen communication involves subtle timing and situational awareness. Asking "how long" at the wrong moment can disrupt workflow, while failing to call behind you when carrying hot pans can cause accidents. Alessandro was learning not just English vocabulary, but the cultural protocols of professional kitchen communication. After mastering the most essential phrases through home practice, Alessandro implemented the second phase of his strategy: strategic question asking at work. This technique was brilliant because it allowed him to practice English conversation in a natural way, while simultaneously building relationships with his colleagues. Alessandro would ask questions about things he already knew or could easily figure out himself. Instead of silently checking the order tickets, he might ask a colleague, "Is table 12 ready to go?" Instead of simply observing prep work, he would inquire, "What vegetables are you working on?" These weren't questions born from genuine confusion, but rather opportunities to engage in brief English exchanges that felt natural and purposeful. The beauty of this approach was that Alessandro's colleagues didn't realize he was practicing English conversation with them. From their perspective, he was simply being collaborative and communicative, positive qualities in any kitchen environment. They were happy to answer his questions because Alessandro was showing interest in their work and demonstrating team-oriented behavior. These brief exchanges gradually became longer conversations. A simple question about vegetable preparation might evolve into a discussion about cooking techniques, seasonal ingredients, or regional food preferences. Alessandro discovered that his colleagues enjoyed sharing their culinary knowledge and experiences, and these conversations provided rich opportunities for English practice in a meaningful context. The transformation in Alessandro's communication skills was remarkable. Within 6 weeks, he was participating actively in the rapid-fire communication that characterizes busy service periods. His colleagues no longer needed to repeat instructions or speak more slowly when addressing him. Alessandro could follow the complex choreography of kitchen communication, understanding not just individual phrases, but the overall flow of information that keeps a professional kitchen operating efficiently. By the 3rd month, Alessandro had achieved something that surprised even himself. He was making jokes in English. Humor is one of the most sophisticated aspects of language use because it requires understanding cultural context, timing, and subtle meanings that go beyond literal translation. When Alessandro started making his colleagues laugh with English wordplay and situational humor, he knew he had crossed an important threshold in his language development. The jokes weren't sophisticated. Often they were simple puns about food or playful comments about kitchen situations. But they were spontaneous, culturally appropriate, and genuinely funny to his English-speaking colleagues. This ability to use humor demonstrated that Alessandro had internalized the rhythm and cultural nuances of English communication in ways that no textbook study could have achieved. Alessandro's success with workplace humor opened up entirely new dimensions of social interaction with his colleagues. During break periods, conversations became more relaxed and personal. Colleagues began sharing stories about their backgrounds, their culinary training, and their experiences working in different restaurants around the world. Alessandro found himself not just understanding these stories, but contributing his own experiences and perspectives. The most significant realization for Alessandro was understanding how much context accelerates language learning compared to isolated study. In the restaurant kitchen, every English phrase he learned had immediate relevance and practical application. The high-frequency repetition of essential expressions, combined with the emotional intensity and social dynamics of professional kitchen work, created ideal conditions for rapid language acquisition. Alessandro contrasted this experience with his previous English learning attempts, which had involved textbooks, classroom exercises, and homework assignments. Those traditional methods had provided him with theoretical knowledge about English, but they hadn't prepared him for the reality of using English as a communication tool in demanding professional situations. The artificial contexts and contrived examples of classroom English bore little resemblance to the authentic, high-stakes communication required in his new job. The kitchen environment provided constant feedback about Alessandro's communication effectiveness. If his English wasn't clear, orders would be delayed, safety protocols might be compromised, or team coordination would suffer. This immediate, practical feedback motivated rapid improvement in ways that classroom grades or test scores never could. Alessandro learned to communicate effectively not because he wanted to impress teachers, but because his professional success and workplace relationships depended on clear English communication. As Alessandro's confidence grew, he began applying his contextual learning approach to other areas of his life in Paris. He started conversations with vendors at local markets, engaged with customers during slower restaurant periods, and even began dating someone he met through work. Each new context provided fresh opportunities to expand his English skills while building meaningful relationships and experiences. I'm going to give you a practical plan for the next 30 days. Morning, 10 minutes of shadowing with a podcast or video. Afternoon, 5 minutes talking to yourself about your day. Evening, 15 minutes watching English content focusing only on listening. Weekend, 20 minutes talking with someone in English even if it's online. Consistency beats intensity. It's better to practice 15 minutes every day than 3 hours once a week. Creating a sustainable practice routine is absolutely essential for making real progress in English fluency. I've seen so many students get excited about learning techniques, try to do everything at once for a few days, then burn out and abandon their practice altogether. The key to lasting improvement is building habits that fit realistically into your existing life, not trying to completely restructure your schedule around English study. The 30-day plan I'm sharing with you is based on years of observing what actually works for busy adults who have jobs, families, and other commitments. This isn't a theoretical study schedule. It's a proven system that has helped hundreds of my students make consistent progress without overwhelming themselves or sacrificing other important areas of their lives. Let's start with your morning shadowing practice. Those first 10 minutes of your day are crucial because your brain is fresh and alert, but you're not yet caught up in the stress and distractions that tend to accumulate as the day progresses. Choose content that energizes you. Maybe it's a motivational podcast, an interview with someone you admire, or even segments from your favorite TV show. The key is consistency, so pick something you actually enjoy listening to. Your morning shadowing content should remain the same for at least a week, preferably 2 weeks. I know this might seem boring, but remember what we learned about repetition. Your brain needs multiple exposures to the same material to really internalize the pronunciation patterns and rhythm. By day 5 or 6, you'll notice that you can shadow much more accurately than on day 1. This improvement will motivate you to continue the practice. The beauty of morning shadowing is that it sets a positive tone for your entire day. You're starting each day by actively using English, which primes your brain to notice English throughout the day. Students often tell me that after establishing a morning shadowing routine, they start automatically picking up on English phrases in music, advertisements, or conversations they overhear. Your afternoon solo speaking practice is strategically placed in the middle of your day because you have real experiences to talk about. Instead of struggling to think of topics, you can naturally discuss what happened during your morning, your lunch break, a meeting you attended, or interactions you had with colleagues. This timing makes the practice feel relevant and meaningful rather than artificial. 5 minutes might seem short, but it's actually perfect for building the habit. If you tell yourself you need to speak for 30 minutes, you'll find excuses to skip the practice when you're busy or tired. But everyone can find 5 minutes, and once you start speaking, you'll often find yourself continuing beyond the minimum time because you get engaged with expressing your thoughts in English. During this afternoon practice, focus on maintaining continuous speech even when you don't know exact words. This is where you develop the crucial skill of communicating despite vocabulary limitations. If you can't remember how to say something perfectly, describe it using simpler words. This kind of creative communication is actually more valuable than perfect vocabulary knowledge. Your evening listening practice serves a different purpose than your morning shadowing. In the evening, you're training your ear to process natural English speech without the additional challenge of trying to speak simultaneously. This is pure comprehension training, allowing your brain to absorb the patterns and rhythms of English without the pressure of production. 15 minutes is long enough to get deeply engaged with content, but short enough that it doesn't interfere with your evening routine or family time. Choose content that interests you personally. If you love cooking, watch cooking videos. If you're interested in business, listen to business podcasts. If you enjoy entertainment, watch English TV shows or YouTube channels about topics you care about. The crucial instruction is to focus only on listening, not on understanding every word. Let the English wash over you like music, paying attention to rhythm, intonation, and overall meaning rather than getting stuck on individual vocabulary items. This relaxed approach to listening helps develop what linguists call global comprehension, the ability to understand general meaning even when you miss specific details. Weekend conversation practice is where you put everything together in real communication situations. 20 minutes might seem like a short conversation, but when you're speaking English, especially if you're not completely comfortable yet, 20 minutes can feel quite substantial. The goal is to have a meaningful exchange with another person, not to fill time or practice mechanically. You have many options for finding conversation partners. Language exchange apps connect you with native English speakers who want to practice your language. Offer affordable conversation practice with professional teachers. Virtual English conversation clubs meet regularly in video calls. Some students even practice with English-speaking friends or colleagues who are happy to help. The key to successful conversation practice is choosing topics you genuinely care about. Don't try to practice academic English unless you're specifically preparing for academic situations. Instead, talk about your hobbies, your work, your family, your travel experiences, or current events that interest you. When you're emotionally engaged with the topic, you'll push yourself to communicate more effectively. What makes this 30-day routine so effective is its balance and sustainability. And you're practicing different skills: pronunciation and rhythm through shadowing, fluency and creativity through solo speaking, comprehension through focused listening, and real communication through conversation. Each activity supports and reinforces the others, creating a comprehensive practice system. The total time commitment is manageable: 30 minutes on weekdays and 20 additional minutes on weekends. This is roughly 3.5 hours per week, which fits realistically into most people's schedules. More importantly, because the practices are spread throughout the day and week, you're maintaining constant contact with English rather than cramming all your practice into one intensive session. Consistency really does beat intensity when it comes to language learning. Your brain needs regular exposure to new language patterns to build strong neural pathways. 3 hours of practice once a week creates a feast or famine cycle that isn't optimal for language acquisition. 15 minutes of daily practice creates steady, continuous input that allows your brain to process and integrate new language patterns gradually and naturally. After 30 days of following this routine, you'll be amazed at how much more natural English feels to you. Your ear will be more attuned to natural pronunciation patterns. Your speaking will be more fluid and confident. Your listening comprehension will have improved significantly, and you'll have developed the courage and skills needed for real English conversations. We've reached the end of another episode of the English Talk community. Remember, fluency is not a destination, it's a journey. Each day you practice, you're one step closer to your goals. If this episode helped you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. In the comments, tell me which of these techniques you're going to start using today. Your journey to fluency begins now, with the next word you're going to speak in English. Until the next episode, keep practicing and believing in yourself. As we wrap up this comprehensive exploration of English fluency development, I want you to take a moment to reflect on how different your understanding of language learning might be now compared to when we started this conversation. We've journeyed together through the stories of Marco, Sofia, and Alessandro, each of whom discovered that the path to fluency isn't what they initially expected it to be. These weren't stories about people with exceptional talent or perfect learning conditions. They were regular individuals facing the same challenges you're experiencing right now: fear of making mistakes, frustration with slow progress, anxiety about accents, and confusion about how to transform theoretical English knowledge into practical communication skills. What made them successful wasn't some special gift, but rather their willingness to change their approach and embrace more natural ways of learning. The techniques we've explored today represent a fundamental shift from traditional English learning methods. Instead of focusing on perfection, we've emphasized communication. Instead of studying about English, we've practiced using English. Instead of avoiding mistakes, we've learned to embrace them as essential steps in the learning process. Instead of trying to sound like someone else, we've discovered how to sound like ourselves, speaking English confidently. Think about the active listening technique that transformed Marco's comprehension abilities. This isn't just a study method, it's a way of training your brain to process English the way native speakers naturally do, in layers of meaning rather than word-by-word translation. When you commit to this approach, you're not just improving your listening skills, you're developing the neural pathways that support all aspects of English fluency. Consider Sofia's journey from voice message practice to confident real-world communication. Her story demonstrates that fluency develops through gradual, consistent practice rather than sudden breakthroughs. The confidence she built through private practice gave her the foundation she needed for successful public communication. Your own practice, even when it feels imperfect or challenging, is building that same foundation for your future English success. Alessandro's workplace immersion approach shows how powerful contextual learning can be. He didn't become fluent by studying English in isolation. He became fluent by using English to accomplish real tasks and build genuine relationships. This principle applies regardless of your specific situation. The English you need for your work, your hobbies, your family, or your personal interests is the English you should prioritize learning. The shadowing technique we discussed isn't just about improving pronunciation, it's about internalizing the music and rhythm of English speech. When you practice shadowing regularly, you're training your brain and mouth to work together more efficiently, creating the automatic responses that characterize fluent speakers. This technique bridges the gap between understanding English and speaking it naturally. Learning language chunks rather than isolated vocabulary transforms how quickly you can express complex ideas. Native speakers don't construct sentences from individual words. They combine familiar phrases and expressions that they've heard and used countless times. When you start collecting and using these chunks, your English immediately sounds more natural and fluent. The mindset shift around mistakes might be the most important change you can make in your English learning journey. Every successful English speaker has made thousands of mistakes on their path to fluency. The difference between those who succeed and those who give up isn't the absence of errors, but the ability to learn from mistakes while maintaining the courage to keep communicating. The 30-day practice routine I've outlined gives you a concrete way to implement all these principles consistently. Remember, the routine itself isn't magical. Its power comes from your commitment to following it regularly. Consistency in language learning creates the repetition your brain needs to build strong neural pathways and automatic responses. Your English fluency journey is unique to you, but you're not alone in facing its challenges. Millions of people around the world are working toward the same goal you have. Some are just starting, others are well along their path. But all successful English learners have discovered what we've discussed today. Fluency develops through practice, patience, and persistence. The next word you speak in English is indeed the beginning of the next phase of your journey. It might be a word you've said hundreds of times before, or it might be a new expression you're trying for the first time. Either way, that word represents your commitment to continued growth and improvement. I want you to remember that progress in language learning isn't always linear or immediately visible. Some days you'll feel like you're making great strides. Other days you might feel like you're struggling with things that seemed easy before. This variation is completely normal and doesn't indicate anything wrong with your abilities or your approach. The community aspect of language learning is crucial for long-term success. When you share your experiences, challenges, and victories with others who are on similar journeys, you create support systems that help sustain motivation during difficult periods. Whether through online communities, language exchange partnerships, or local conversation groups, connecting with other English learners enriches your learning experience. As you implement these techniques and approaches, pay attention to what works best for your specific learning style, schedule, and goals. Adapt the methods we've discussed to fit your life rather than trying to completely restructure your life around language learning. Sustainable progress happens when language practice becomes a natural part of your daily routine rather than an additional burden. Your fluency journey continues with every English conversation you have, every podcast you listen to, every video you watch, and every message you write. Each interaction is an opportunity to apply what you've learned and to discover new aspects of English communication. Trust the process, be patient with yourself, and celebrate the progress you make along the way.